video, we are going to take a look at a brand new lens from Zeiss. This is the Zeiss Otus ML 85mm f1.4. It is an apochromatic Sonnar-based design that comes in a portrait focal length, so if you are a fan of the Sonnar look, this lens is absolutely outstanding. In fact, in my testing, it is noticeably better than the DSLR version. It is available for Sony E mount, Nikon Z mount, as well as Canon RF mount, and comes in at a much lower price than its DSLR predecessor. Welcome back, everyone. I am very excited to be making this video for you guys today because for me personally, this has probably been the most anticipated lens release of the entire year. Many of you probably remember back in February, Zeiss announced after a several-year hiatus from making any photography-based lenses that they were returning, and they were going to do this by bringing the Otus series to mirrorless. And so this is the Otus ML 85mm f1.4. So when they announced this in February, they did release the 50mm version of this lens, which I absolutely love. I did 2 different videos on that. It is fantastic, but I was really excited about the 85 for a number of reasons, but mainly because the original DSLR 85mm Otus was one of my favorite lenses ever made. In fact, I have one right here. It is fabulous. So at the time, Zeiss were making mirrorless lenses for Sony cameras. They had the Loxia lineup and the Batis lineup. These were all named after bird species. The Otus lenses were a little bit different because with this lens, they set out basically to create the most high-resolving lens possible with no constraints on either price or size. It was a very expensive lens at its time, and it was a huge lens, as you can see right here. There's a lot of glass in here. It is big. It is a great lens. However, for me, it is a studio lens. So when we talked about this whole idea of bringing the Otus over to mirrorless, I knew because we're having to redesign for a closer mount that this would mean a new design for the lens and something that is much more compact and a little more portable, and I think they've actually done it here. I've had this lens for about a month now. This is a production version of the lens. It is not a pre-production. So this exact lens that I've been using, that you're going to see in the sample shots, is basically the same lens that you would go buy at the store today. And I have absolutely fallen in love with this. So I'm going to do this video a little bit differently today. I usually go through specs and a bunch of stuff like that. I'm going to go straight into image quality. So one of the notable things about this lens is Zeiss referred to this as an apo-Sonnar design. I'll get into what Sonnar means in a second, but Sonnar was essentially a lens formula that was designed really in the early days of lens design. So we're talking about the late 20s. And the version that we have today is definitely more modernized. But one of the characteristics of Sonnar lens formulas, especially when you get into portrait-oriented lenses, is that you can expect very sharp points of focus and then a beautiful bokeh. And it's very soft and very lush. And it's exactly what you get here. These are some portraits that I did of a friend of mine. This is Ava Rose. And some of you may know her because she's a ballet dancer and was in my workshop in New York this year. But anyway, if I zoom into my point of focus, which is her eye, we can see that we have an incredibly high resolution. In fact, the resolution is outstanding on here. And as it falls off, we have a very sharp fall off, which is a modern lens staple. And then when I zoom back out, you can see that we've got a very lush background. So this is one of the things that you can expect out of a Sonnar lens design. It's one of the things that I love about them a lot because I'll show you another example. So in this case, we've got basically a very minimal background, but this allows you to kind of see some of the characteristics of what the lens is doing. Again, if I go in, you can see that we are tack sharp on the eye there. And if we come back out, it is very soft. Now, this is a white background, and the reason that I wanted to use this as an example, because I want to note that there's absolutely no distortion in this lens whatsoever, and there is a little bit of vignetting that is correctable. I, however, am of the camp that likes a little bit of vignetting in portraits, and I think it's something that enhances the image in certain situations. It's easily correctable in Lightroom if you wanted to take that out. There's a lens profile in here that is already built in. All you have to do is enable it, but you can see that there is really no distortion, and we just have a slight amount of vignetting. Another thing that I want to note is that all the sample images that you're seeing in this video are taken wide open at f1.4, which is something that I wouldn't normally do, and the reason I say this, I'd like a little bit more depth of field. And on a lot of lenses, you're going to get to its best point around f2 or so, and then the more you stop down, the more it corrects itself. But I will say that this lens fulfills the original idea of the Zeiss Otus series, which is to have as perfect an image as possible all the way wide open. And so all the images here are at f1.4. Another thing that I really love about this lens is the way that it handles color rendering. So I intentionally shot this in mixed white balance. So sun's going down, we're outside the studio, and there's just a little bit of light coming from this ambient source. And it's a warm color light, and it actually handles this just great. Everything looks fantastic. And that's another thing that you can expect from Zeiss lenses is just the color rendition is so beautiful on these things. It really is is outstanding. Another thing that I want to note, if we want to pick apart the bokeh a little bit more, because I think that is a standout highlight of this lens, which is awesome because it is designed to be a portrait lens. But a lot of times when you see lesser lenses in the way that they render bokeh, if you're dealing with straight lines that happen in the fallen off areas where it's blurry, like for instance, this railing that she's leaning against, one of the things that you'll notice in lesser lenses is that the bokeh tends to double up with hard lines like that, and it becomes distracting and it's very unrealistic. This is very smooth and you don't get any of that. It really is gorgeous. And of course, with you're dealing with distances that are further away, you can see that the bokeh just melts off into the background. It really does look beautiful. I didn't find this distracting in any scenario that I put it in. It really is just gorgeous all the time. Another thing that I want to point out that's very impressive about this lens, and I did a couple shots just to show this off, but typically speaking with any lens, bokeh is one thing to do in the background rendering. It's another thing when something is back focused from the front. So if you have objects that are in front of the point of focus, sometimes that's not really good looking bokeh. But I did some tests in this, and like for instance in this shot, her hand is in front. The bokeh is resolved very nicely. Nothing is distracting. It looks really good. I also did some shots where her head is tilted a little bit. Her chin comes into play, and everything just looks fantastic. In fact, one of the cool things with any of the better Sonnar type lenses is that bokeh is so beautiful. Sometimes when things are just right outside the point of focus, they're not sharp, but they really look gorgeous. Now, one thing I do want to point out about image quality is this is a very high performance lens, and that's something that you actually want out of a modern design. You want your points of focus to resolve just absolutely as best as they can. Now, in the case of doing portraits, you will notice when I zoom into some of these that with skin tones, you are going to pick up a lot of textures. This is actually something you want in a lens because you want that micro contrast. You want the texture display to be there. This is the mark. This shows you this is a really well-designed lens. However, it does pick up every blemish possible. So depending on your model or your subject, this might be something that's problematic for some people. So plan on doing a little bit of post-production to probably smooth that out. But for most purpose shots, and as you can see in all my examples, this is an absolutely outstanding lens design, and I have been very happy shooting with this. So the image quality is fantastic, but I also want to talk about build quality and handling a little bit with this lens. But the first point I want to make is that yes, this is a manual focus lens. There is no autofocus. Oddly, that is a huge point of contention for some people, and I am not going to disagree that autofocus in the modern age is nothing short of incredible. Sony, Canon, Nikon, Panasonic have all done an amazing job in that field. However, there are some downsides to autofocus lenses when you want to manual focus. The first one for me is having a focus by wire system where the wheel just spins freely and it electronically activates what the camera needs to do to move the focus point. It doesn't feel realistic, and so there is room for people like myself in photography, or if you wanted to use this lens for video and you want to do manual focus pulling, that this really is the real deal, and it is extremely well built, and it should be. Nothing is plasticky feeling on here. Everything is well made. It's very solid. The focusing is actually very smooth on here, and for manual focusing, this is something that's important. I mean, I'm shooting as somebody who's modeling for me essentially, so there's not a lot of motion back and forth, but she could turn her head, and at f1.4, that field of focus is so shallow, I need to be able to follow that a little bit, and I found it's really easy to do on here, and I don't use focus peaking or anything. I just use the diopter and make sure that it's tuned in to my own vision, and I just use the screen. I do punch in for critical focus if I need to, but generally speaking, 9 times out of 10, I'm getting great results on here, and so it really is fantastic. Some other things to note about this lens, one thing that's very impressive, as it was on the 50mm version, is the aperture assembly is extremely well done. There are 10 aperture blades on here. There's reason that is important. It's when you stop down, it means that your circular highlights or your bokeh balls are going to stay perfectly round. That is something that is very important, especially if you want to go down to f2 for some reason. You need a little more depth of field. So this lens is very impressive in how it's put together. Now, in terms of weight, it is much more reasonable than the DSLR version, as it should be. And that is something that is most notable for me, because as much as I love the DSLR version, it ends up living in my studio. I don't tend to take that out very much just because it's so big. Now, I will say that it is obviously going to be bigger than the 50mm Otus ML, but it is still manageable. I want to talk a little bit about the differences in the optical design between this new ML version and the original DSLR version, because the two lenses are quite different, but I think it's important to start with the idea of the Sonnar lens type. So if you consider the early days of lens design, we have all of these designs that come along that basically deal with 3 elements or 3 element groups. So you have things like the Cook triplet, you have the Ernestar configuration, and then in 1929, a gentleman named Ludwig Bertelli, who worked for Zeiss, develops this idea of the Sonnar Sonnar lens format. So you can consider this to be 3 groups or 3 element groups, however you want to break that down. But why 3? And I think that's something that's very important. Well, if you consider a lens design and you consider an optic such as this is a lens element. When light comes through an uncoated piece of glass, you have reflection. So when it comes through the front, you lose a little bit of light due to reflection, and same with the rear. And so for this reason, you would lose a little bit of light transmission every time that light has to pass between an air to glass surface. And the limitation back in the days before we had coated lens designs was about 3 groups. So you might have a group where you have 2 elements that are cemented together, but that's not an air surface. That's a cemented together surface, so it would pass through without losing light transmission. So we were limited to 6 surfaces. So we had all these configurations where designers were coming up with ways to do that and still get optimal corrections. And I think that Bertelli certainly hit a home run with this, because the Sonnar format has been used in probably thousands of lenses since it was designed in the 1920s. Now later on we do have coatings of optics, and so we have different coating types, and the coatings have just improved over the years, as well as the glass materials. So today we can have a lot more elements in a lens. So I'll show you the difference between these 2 lenses first of all. You're going to notice that actually the ML version that we're looking at today has more glass in it than the DSLR version. The DSLR version was 11 elements in 9 groups. The ML version is 15 elements in 11 groups. You'll also note on here that a lot of these elements that are added in are made with special glass, so they're probably extra low dispersion glass. And the idea here is that we get rid of all chromatic aberration that you're going to find in the lens. And I will say in my testing of this, and I've tried to find it because I did that with the first lens, that I did not find any. This is a very, very well-designed lens. Another note that I want to make, when I reviewed the 50mm, and for some reason people took this out of context, and I understand it is confusing, Zeiss initially sent me a pre-production version of that lens, and I did find some purple fringing on there. It went away when you stopped down, but somebody noted in the comments that that's not actually chromatic aberration if you're able to get rid of it by stopping down. And so that probably was something in the pre-production version that wasn't quite finished. And so Zeiss did send me a production version of that lens, which I made the second video with, and it was completely fixed. These lenses really are first class, and I was really hard when I did that initial review of the lens, and I probably shouldn't have been with something that was pre-production. There's so many tolerances and things in these lenses. They're very complex, and up until the 11th hour when the actual commercial release comes out, I know these companies are working on them, but both these lenses are absolutely fantastic. They're some of the best lenses I have ever used. So one downside to this lens is going to be the price. It is not a cheap lens. This lens does come in at $2,999 US. However, I will argue that the original DSLR version, when it was released 11 years ago, so we're not even doing inflation calculations here, but it came out at $4,500 US dollars. So this lens is actually $1,500 cheaper than the original. I think it is actually better than the original. I will do some side-by-sides when I do a complete review, but in my initial testing, I am noticing a big difference. This lens is outstanding, and you're going to get what you pay for, and you're paying for optics at this point and construction. It is a very solid lens, and it is very well built. So for people who want to use a manual focus lens, I think it is well worth the money. And I do want to state that I want to do some further testing with this lens. As I mentioned, the original version is probably one of my favorite lenses ever made. In fact, shameless plug here, the cover of my book I actually shot with the Zeiss Otus 85, the DSLR version. I shot it on a Sony camera. We're using an adapter. And so the whole idea of using adapters and the fact that the lens is just so massive make it very difficult to take anywhere. It ends up being a studio lens for a full frame camera. And so it doesn't get as much use as I would like to have. But one of the things that I'm going to say about the ML version is I've been shooting this quite a bit over the last month, and I've been having a lot of fun. It is much more manageable. It's easier to take out. It's not exactly the most portable 85mm lens that you could possibly use. It is a trade-off because it's an f1.4, but it's extremely well made. This has been kind of a first look. I've had this for a month, and I want to do some more testing with this, and I want to follow up because I really am this excited about the Otus ML. If there's anything you guys would like to see, drop me a note in the comments, and I'll see if I can get to it when I do a further review on this. But anyway, that's it for today. I will catch you guys in the next video. Until then, later.